The two major panels that have already spoken, and very eloquently, have given us a graphic portrait of the economic issues that we face and of the threats to Social Security and Medicare that are inherent in the present tenor of the economic debate. And they've also described in a very moving way, and I must say I was particularly touched by Harold Pollack's family story. They've given very moving testimony to the value of these programs. And I think it is important for those of us who are often critical of the social protections in this country to recognize that these programs are successes, and they're successes by any standard. They are the greatest social policy successes that we have known in the history of this country, the most enduring. And they are also, I think if you make a careful comparison, successes by standard of comparison with the countries that we often compare ourselves with. They are large, stable, social policy achievements on a continental scale, which has not been achieved elsewhere in the world. What I want to do with my time this morning is to address a very specific aspect of the debate, and to do so as an economist, and to ask whether the fear of long-term deficits should legitimately be used to justify proposed cuts in Social Security and Medicare, and for that matter, whether that fear of long-term deficits stands as, from an economic policy standpoint, as an effective obstacle to the entire project of a new strategic direction for economic growth and recovery. And in order to address that question, I need to say a few words about the work of an institution which is in some ways justifiably an icon in this city, one of the very few respected nonpartisan and professional organizations that we have, the Congressional Budget Office, whose work is used as the foundation for much of the debate over the future fiscal position of the United States. The CBO has an important professional function, and everybody who has been on the Hill, as Congresswoman Kennelly has and as I have, understands what that is. It is to provide a fair evaluation of the budget costs of particular legislative proposals. That's the fundamental job for which the CBO was established. It was to permit people to make proposals and to have them come back costed in a way that was trustworthy, transparent, and consistent. That's what, in order to do that, you need to have a common set of baseline economic projections. And that's the function of the baseline projections, is to provide that standard of consistency. For that purpose, however, it is not necessarily important that the baseline forecast be realistic as a projection of what the economic future is going to be. So long as it's consistent and everything is being judged by the same yardstick, then the internal consistency of that forecast is a secondary consideration. But those forecasts are being turned very much and used for a much different purpose. That is to say, to describe for us all the fiscal future of the United States. And as those forecasts are presently constructed, that future looks to many people to be extraordinarily scary, with the public debt spiraling out of control. And since that is the issue, it is important to ask whether the forecasts are realistic. And for that, we have to ask, how does the CBO proceed in making that forecast? Essentially, this is another two-step. And I don't mean it in a pejorative sense. It is simply a two-stage process that the CBO uses. The first step in their process is to assume away our current economic difficulties over a period of time. That is to say, to assume that the economy will recover from the recent crisis and recession, and that's generally over a 5-year horizon. We return to a relatively low rate of unemployment, and to get there, we have a relatively rapid rate of growth. Now, if this were to happen, it would be great. We'd all be in favor of it. If it were to happen without any changes in policy, it would be wonderful. We would all be delighted. And in addition to that, of course, with economic recovery, people would resume paying income taxes and the deficits would fall, as they did in the 1990s when we moved to full employment and the budget went into surplus. The problem with this as a projection of the actual future is the one already given very eloquently at the start of this program by Tom Paley, which is the growth model that got us to full employment in the late 1990s and that got us closer to full employment in the 1980s, a model based upon the very rapid expansion of bank credit for various purposes in the late 1990s, the drive for information technology investment, and in the 2000s, for that matter, the housing bubble. That model is broken. The institutions that underpinned that form of growth are not going to do it again. The institutions themselves remain deeply impaired by the effects of the crisis, and they don't have customers. They don't have households with equity they can borrow it against. They don't have businesses who are out there trying to find credit for business expansion. So we're not going to go that way. We are not going to return to full employment by any automatic process. Having assumed that we are, however, then what the CBO does is to recreate very large deficits with a new series of assumptions that kick in after the effects of economic recovery are felt. One of them is runaway healthcare costs and the assumption that the worst things that could happen in that sector are going to happen. I'll leave that one aside for the most part. The second one, which is very important, is that there will be a return to what are historically very high real interest rates. A nominal interest rate on short-term money of about 5% with a 2% inflation rate, or a real interest rate on short-term money of 3%, as opposed to the present levels, which are negative 1.5% to 2%. So a 4 to 5% shift in the short-term real rate of interest, which is the rate that applies to government debt. And the second thing that happens as a consequence of that, very largely, is an enormous run-up in the net interest payments of the federal government, running up to fantastic values, 20% and plus of GDP in 25 or 30 years, which is an expenditure item on the federal budget. And these two things are supposed to happen in conjunction with a very low rate of inflation, 2%, with the result that debt in comparison to nominal GDP spirals out of control. That is where the long-term budget deficit and debt projection comes from. And you have to ask, are there weak points from the standpoint of an economic realist in this projection? And I think there are two major weak points. One is that it is extremely unlikely that the Federal Reserve will return or would return to a high short-term real interest rate in the absence of a rise in inflation. There's no reason why they would take that step. If they did take it, it would have catastrophic effects on business investment. It would precipitate us back into recession, most likely. And there's very little historical precedent for such a policy. There is one period in the post-war period when we had 3% real interest rates, 4% real interest rates with a 2% inflation rate, and that was the late 1990s. It wasn't true in the 50s and 60s. It wasn't true in the 2000s. The 70s were an unstable period in which the inflation assumptions didn't apply. And those 1990s years were very different from our present situation. So there's no logical reason for that assumption to be there, but it generates an enormous part of this deficit debt dynamic. And the second problem is that those interest payments, which are generated, are public spending. They have to go to somebody. We're not wiring them to Mars. We're sending them to people who hold U.S. government debt. That's going to show up as income on those people's accounts, income that would amount to 3-4 times the total of present defense spending in relation to GDP. Vast sums that look like the mobilization for World War II more than they look like anything else, although they're not going for anything particular except checks into people's bank accounts. You have to assume that money would be spent. Some of it would be, in which case the inflation projection is surely out the window. And if the inflation projection's out the window, the debt to GDP ratio isn't going to look like they project it's going to be. So my position and my argument to you is that much of the debate on this issue is based on a mirage hidden inside technical assumptions which are not terribly damaging for the most of the purposes that the CBO has, but which are completely inappropriate for a serious discussion of the actual fiscal position of the United States and its actual economic condition. That's not to say that we aren't likely to have large deficits going forward. The answer to that is we are. But those large deficits are likely to be due in the future to the same reason that we have them today, which is an underperforming economy, a very high rate of unemployment, relatively low tax take given to what, in comparison to what it would be at potential. And that will be accompanied not with high, but with very low, continuing very low interest rates, with different implications for the debt. What this suggests is that when you think about this problem coherently, the long-term policy problem is the same as the short-term policy problem. It is to create jobs and to place the economy back on the footing of stable prosperity. And that is both the desirable objective per se and something which will require a sustained effort, a new strategic direction, as well as a comprehensive reform which has not actually occurred and is not sufficiently addressed in the financial reform bills of the financial sector to make it, once again, an effective functioning part of the economy. And that's the correct strategy, as I said, not only for economic growth and the condition of the economy in the medium and long term, but also for the funding of Social Security and Medicare. Because as has been argued, again, very effectively in the earlier panels, the major problem, and Eric Larson made this point very clearly, of Social Security and Medicare's funding is low wage growth and inadequate employment. That is, not enough people paying the payroll taxes at present rates. Fix that problem, and the other problem, to the extent that it is a problem, goes away. There was a comment earlier about the Reinhardt-Rogoff study, and Tom made a very effective rebuttal. But suppose it were even true that large public debts were associated in general with low economic growth in countries whose conditions were comparable to our own. Why would that be the case? It would be the case because those countries do not have an effective growth mechanism generated by the private financial sector, so that they do not have a credit system which is creating jobs and enabling people to pay taxes that cover the services that the public sector provides. These two problems are integrated, they cannot be separated, and even if Reinhardt and Rogoff were right about their diagnosis, the prescription cannot be simply cutting the public sector's interventions in the economy. It has to be to repair the other side of the balance sheet. So that's the first step that it seems to me a strategic program for the economy has to take, to recognize that the private sector is important, that it has taken a colossal hit in the last 3 years as a result of a colossal mismanagement in the previous 15 or so, and that the reconstruction of a functioning private financial sector that serves our economic purposes is an indispensable priority. What else do we need to do? What are the other components of the program? It seems to me that we ought to be recognizing right now that we have an ongoing housing crisis, and the problems of home mortgage finance are being, and for that matter of mortgage fraud, are being compounded at the moment by a vast new industry of practically automated foreclosures, driving hundreds of thousands of people out of their homes on the basis of incomplete and shoddy documentation. This is an emerging social crisis, and stabilizing people in their homes is an emerging and hugely important social priority for stabilizing jobs, neighborhoods, local property tax revenues, and an entire infrastructure of the American economy. Part and parcel of that, extending from it very slightly, is the step that's already been discussed through the morning on a number of occasions, need to stabilize the budgets of states and localities for the duration of the crisis. There is no reason why in an economic downturn we should be tolerating the destruction of public schools, of police and fire forces, the closing of libraries, the non-maintenance of parks. These are services on which people rely, on which they fall back in hard economic times. And it's just an artifact of the way we structured things that they're under such pressure. There's no economic reason why they should be. Steps should be taken to take this problem off the books. And Heather Boushey made a political argument as to why Democratic Congress doesn't want to help Republican governors. Fine. Do it the other way. Take Greg Anrich's suggestion and federalize Medicaid, and you will have a flow of funds that will go to the states and localities that will help deal with that problem. But then you need to think about how the national economy can be made to grow. And here it seems to me that the important concept is once again encaptured by the word strategic, a strategic policy imparting a new direction to economic growth. We have had, broadly speaking, recognizable strategies in the past. In the post-war period, we created a broad middle class that was largely home-owning. Institutions achieved this. In the late 1990s, we created a very large and effective and internationally successful information technology sector, in part through a drumbeat of public promotion of the importance of these technologies. I don't think there was a day in the Clinton-Gore administration in which the president or the vice president didn't talk about the importance and value of those industries. What is it going to be going forward? I think it's clear that we have to address our energy challenges, our climate challenge, and that part of doing so involves the reconstruction of the country. That is to say, giving people choices about the way in which we produce and use energy. And for that, we need to rebuild our infrastructure. There are other reasons why we need to rebuild many other things we could do to rebuild our common public capital. But this is one very important reason to do so. And you need to do this in a way which is known to the private sector to be sustained, because you need to have both public and private investment moving down this road. And that is a reason for enacting a national infrastructure fund. To create an institution akin to the Reconstruction Finance Corporation and akin to institutions that have existed and still exist in many countries around the world, which gives the private sector confidence that there will be a sustained effort in this direction, that their investments, in which they're staking their own money, have a good chance of paying off. And the same can be said for jobs programs. It seems to me that they should be put in place, and they should be focused on goals and objectives which meet our immediate needs but also provide hope for progress toward solving the actual economic and environmental problems that the country has. So not temporary, but permanent. And the second thing one has to say about this is that one does have to address the question of getting up to scale and of moving toward a recovery program which can be perceived by the public to be making a difference in their lives in a relatively short period of time. And for that reason, it seems to me one element of this should include wholesale measures, measures which will affect a large number of people in a short period of time if they work. There's been some discussion about having a payroll tax holiday for this purpose, and that is to give a major injection of funds into working American families so that they can use to rectify their balance sheets, improve their consumption. But this is the same reason that I also supported the president's decision to take a proposal which originated in the Reagan tax cuts of a major tax break for business investment, expensing of current business investment. The idea here is, even though this is a vast subsidy to capital, if it works, business investment will pick up together and you will get a reciprocal effect of firms' investment activities stimulating the investment activities of other firms and begin to move from a vicious to a virtuous cycle of economic growth. Still, even if you do all of that, we have to face the reality that the crisis that we have experienced has been profound beyond any of our professional experience. We have lost more jobs, and people have stayed out of work longer than was true in the 70s or the 80s, or in the recession at the end of certainly at the recession at the end of the millennium. We've lost 8 million jobs. Many of those have been lost by older workers. Many of them by older workers for whom work is hard, not people like me who speak from a microphone and sit in a chair, but people who stand up behind cash registers with back braces year in and year out. And we have to recognize that looking for jobs for many of those people is an exercise in futility and will be so until they're ready for Social Security, because there will always be a younger or a healthier person who's a better bet for that job and who actually needs the job more in many respects because they're starting out rather than finishing up. This is why it seems to me that another wholesale measure that we should be considering is to reduce the age of eligibility for Social Security and Medicare. This would, and what I've suggested is, and I haven't worked out the numbers, but what I've suggested is that we create a window, the way universities do when they need to get rid of an ineffective professor. At the age of 62, for the next 3 years, you could retire with full benefits. Right? And allow people for whom that's a good deal, which is to say people for whom work has been hardest, to take it up. And someone asked, I believe it was you, what do you do for the older workers who still want to look for jobs? No, it was the young lady. And the answer to that is one thing, because other workers who still want jobs would find it easier to get them if they weren't competing with this enormous pool. And in addition, younger people would find it easier. There would be more openings for young people. The whole unemployment rate would come down, and the whole population would be on a happier and more rational footing in a very, very early stage. And the same thing would be true if you did a proposal I've been talking about for years to reduce the age of eligibility for Medicare to 55 and allow people who have medical issues but who are holding on to that job just because of their insurance to move on if they want to. We are getting the opposite proposal. A proposal for cuts in both of these programs and a proposal that takes the form, I would bet it will take the form, of further increases in the retirement age. And we've talked about the consequences of raising the retirement age to 70, up to 40% cut in the lifetime stream of benefits for those who, for one reason or another, are obliged to take early retirement under those conditions. This is justified on the very shallow grounds that the average age of life in the population is getting older, a fact which is only the case because we've been paying people successfully under Social Security and Medicare to live longer. A real example of successful economic incentives, if you ask me. But the fact is that that increase in life expectancy doesn't apply to the bottom half of the income distribution. It's much less for those who actually work hard in their working lives. So we understand, I think, that that policy is a particularly invidious, dishonest, and cruel way to approach whatever you do about Social Security and Medicare. But I want to stress that it has also very adverse economic effects. It would make unemployment worse by requiring people to hang on to jobs that they would otherwise happily give up in favor of other applicants, contestants for those jobs. So you are simply in an environment of where you haven't gotten back to full employment, you are simply congesting the labor queue by doing this and creating problems which will afflict younger workers for their entire lives as they experience long periods of job search and unemployment before they get that crucial first job. Overall in the economy, you'll get less demand, you will get less growth, and the economy will not be meeting the needs of its actual population. Poverty will be greater under these proposals. All of this is avoidable, it's unnecessary. It is certainly not justified by the argument that we face somehow a long-term, very hard to specify in any concrete sense, problem with the funding of the United States government. One has to ask, though, if you could pin a deficit hawk to the wall, which I would very much like to do, and get them to try and tell you what it is that they are worried about, what would such a person say? Well, I think the only thing they would say is that with the United States soaking up capital funds, with the government soaking up capital funds, there would be less available for business. And if there's less available for business, that means the cost of funds for business must be much higher. And that will show up. Where will that show up? That will show up in the interest rate. So we have to ask, all of these people from Wall Street who are speaking about this know what they're talking about. Have they looked at the interest rate lately? The capital markets are, in some ways, the arbiter of this. And if you ask, are the capital markets afraid that the United States government is going to run into difficulty paying off its debts? Are they unwilling to lend to the U.S. government because they fear a rising rate of inflation? The answer is not in the next 30 years. Not over the longest term of debt that the U.S. government presently issues, where the interest rate has been falling and is now at practically historical lows. 3.6% for 30 years, as last time I looked. So we have, I think, a refutation. It's not the most conclusive bit of evidence, but it is a fairly strong refutation coming from the heights of finance itself, of the idea that the problems that appear on a superficial glance in the budget projections of the Congressional Budget Office, the idea that those problems are actually taken seriously by people who have money, their own money and other people's money on the line. There's been a good deal of talk, and I'll wrap up just on this point, of the sustainability of Social Security, and the point has been made that very small adjustments in payroll tax formulas would cover the actuarial deficit over 75 years of the Social Security Trust Fund. I want to push the argument just a little bit further and to make the point that even if this were not the case, even if there was a substantial difference between what the payroll tax is expected to take in and what Social Security is expected to pay out, the programs would still be sustainable. One has to ask, what is it that Social Security and Medicare actually do? You cannot separate the public effect from the effect on private finances. What Social Security does is to provide a benefit, a payment, to the elderly population, survivors and dependents, which in some respects replaces payments that those who have families prepared to support them would otherwise make, and assures that those who do not have families that would otherwise support them get a payment anyway on the basis of their past contributions to the system. The payroll tax likewise assures that you make a contribution whether you have parents you would otherwise support or not. Right? So when you think about this, and assuming that you don't want the elderly population to get out of the way by dying off, the major transfers in both halves of this are not from the young to the old. They're within the elderly population, from those who would otherwise have means to those who don't, and within the working population from those who would otherwise not have burdens to those who otherwise would. In economic terms, both of those transfers occur in the present. They're not matters that pass back and forth across time, and they both can be sustained indefinitely. They are also fair. They are generous in the broad sense of that term. That is to say, they are wise. They are just. And they give us a society which is vastly happier than it could ever otherwise be. Mike said, and I'll close on this, that his Medicare does not benefit society. I guarantee you it benefits your children and your grandchildren who otherwise don't have to worry about the specific consequences of something that might happen to you in terms of the medical costs, and who would otherwise be worried greatly about this, because it spreads the risk over all of us, which is what we should properly be doing. And again, there is no financial impediment to carrying forward along those lines. So, Congress will face recommendations on the 1st of December from a commission of very doubtful judgment and fairness. And it seems to me very important that Congress take the message from this panel and from all of our efforts that it should not panic, that it should not be panicked, that it is not facing any form of an emergency that requires action in the lame duck session, action which, on mature reflection, we would only come to regret. What we need to do is to continue discussing these issues, continue the process of educating the American public, actually not the American public so much as the American policy elites, about what the American public already knows, which is that these programs are stable, they are successful, and not only that, they are a vital element in the design of a successful strategy for economic growth and recovery going forward. Thanks very much.
Time for a couple of questions.
Okay.
Yes, I know. I'm just getting my nerves. Hello, Dr. Galbraith. My name is David Dixon. I work with the LaRouche Political Action Committee. And I just wanted to put a question to you about infrastructure in the capacity for mobilizing the economy. One of the things that was raised earlier, which I think came out of the New Deal, was the phrase economic planning. And I think that idea was probably best expressed, to my knowledge, by David Lilienthal, who ran the TVA, when he wrote that he found the greatest benefits from the TVA not to be the direct revenue returns on the production of power, but indirectly, as creating a platform for the entire region, whence the future economic potential for the region came. But there's something more that I wanted to add to that, which was a very interesting point which Mr. LaRouche has raised a number of times, which is the contribution of a scientist named Vladimir Vernadsky, who was a biogeochemist in Russia at the time, whose real contribution in understanding something in his field, the flow of matter through the biosphere, which he called the biogenic migration of atoms.
If you don't mind, I'm not going to be able to answer that question because that's very far out of my sphere. But I will talk to you a little bit. Let me talk a little bit. I want. We only have a few minutes, and I want to get to
my actual question.
You can ask your actual
Okay,
question.
my actual question is a hypothetical thing, which is, if you were, as Dean Baker has recently suggested, to fill Larry Summers' position, would you be inclined to moving in the direction of long-term investments in infrastructure projects?
My so-called friends, Dean Baker, oh, the things that they wish for me, I can't imagine. I'll give you a very specific answer because I'm on the record about this. I live on the periphery of the Gulf Coast. And the Gulf Coast is one of the most ecologically stressed regions of the continent. And that was true before the BP blowout. It's true for reasons of land subsidence. It's true for reasons of tropical conditions that are being aggravated as climate change becomes more serious. It's also a region with major industrial facilities and substantial engineering talent. And it seems to me that if we were thinking in terms of a regional development strategy, we could do quite well to establish a Gulf Reconstruction Authority that would apply the technical and engineering capacity that we have to the needs of this region in a changing environmental situation. So that's very much modeled on what the TVA did, but with different, obviously the TVA was partly there to harness hydroelectric power in the region. The needs in the Gulf are substantially different, much more oriented toward mitigating environmental changes that are already going on and have been for some time. And I think that's a very useful piece of setting a strategic direction. And it also points to something else, which is that the country is diverse, and different regions do have different requirements. They face different threats. And it would be very useful as part of this to strengthen our capacity to develop the appropriate approaches at the regional and local level, which is something you can do with national labs, it's something you could do through universities. So I'm thinking, as you think about strategy as opposed to stimulus, that you do need to build layers of institutions that can address these problems effectively.
My name's Hugh Walkup. I really appreciated your analysis of labor forces, but I think there's a baby elephant in the room I'd like you to talk about, and that's that we're raising a lot more poor kids now than we were before, and we seem to be getting better at doing that, even though there's a fairly negative correlation between poverty and educational attainment. And that seems to have impacts on the productivity of the labor force, the chances to increase tax revenues, and kind of the state of the economy. Could you address, well, and the one other thing that seems to be going on is that we're treating that issue by bashing schools and teachers rather than addressing income policy that underlies the reason why we've got more poor kids. Could you address that?
I think you've already, in your question, pointed to part of the answer, which is that a fairly large part of our system of local public services, and especially schools, is directed towards serving the population at large, and cutbacks in that area are going to have an especially harsh effect on lower income children. But beyond that, and others on the panel have spoken, I think, already to some of the healthcare issues that are involved here and things that might be done there. Beyond that, this is part of the reason why I think we should be, in thinking about jobs, sensitive to the claim of young adults for good employment prospects. And that's, I mean, again, one can talk about jobs programs, which would be a useful thing to have, but you would be accomplishing a great deal in a jobs program if you had 500,000 people employed in it. It would be very, very substantial. If you want to deal with the 8 million jobs that we've lost, you have to work on a scale of things that can affect the labor force status of large numbers of people in a short amount of time. And that again comes back to the argument I was making earlier for an extension temporary of full benefit retirement is to improve the economic prospects for younger adults, which obviously is going to have an important beneficial effect on their children.
I'm Dr. Caroline Poplin, and I wanted to ask something that hasn't really been talked about except maybe at the beginning. It's a variation of what's the matter with Kansas problem. How are we, I agree with you completely, but how are we going to get those kinds of programs through when most of the people in this country blame the government for our current problems instead of the corporate sector, which is not investing in the production of goods and services, but rather in asset bubbles, and is paying workers less rather than paying them more. We have no labor unions anymore. Incomes need to go up. Investment needs to be directed towards the production of goods and services, but instead, people blame the government and say it's because the government is running a huge deficit. How do you get people to understand what's actually going on?
Well, I think the problem, I think people do understand pretty well what's happening to them. They know what they prize. I don't think that public policy, public leaders have spoken effectively to what people prize in what they actually receive from government. The quality of their local public services is extremely important to people. People all across the country are deeply involved in their public schools. There's an enormous civic enterprise, actually, which I don't think you will find in you'll find it in some other countries, but not all. And if we spoke to the effect and delivered in ways that were tangible to what people prize and wish for in these things, I think their attitudes toward government as a whole might not change, but at least they would appreciate that they were getting an efficiently delivered service. And the fact is, when they come into contact with Social Security and Medicare, they practically don't recognize it as government because the systems function so well. And so you have this wonderful don't let the government get its hands on my Medicare syndrome. My basic answer, and I don't live in Kansas, but I do live in Texas, is we should be quite concrete about when we speak about these issues, and we should develop policies that go directly to the heart of the matter and address the concerns and crises that people actually face. We did something effective on foreclosures that would be immediately felt by hundreds of thousands of people, just for example.
Time to wrap up.
Okay?
Yep.
Done. Thank you very much, and I'll invite the third panel.